Hello everyone, this is Major Green, also known as Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about the movie Deadpool 2, which I just saw and I liked it a lot. And I am a very big fan of the whole X-Men franchise, even though I'm very much annoyed by all the continuity mistakes, because I'm kind of a perfectionist, so I like it better when everything ties together neatly, which by the way, in the Avengers franchise, that is actually very well done in that one. Not perfect, but almost perfect. Like everything ties together very neatly with a lot of consistency and continuity, and I love that kind of attention to detail. However, in X-Men, there's a whole bunch of continuity contradictions, and they seem to kind of reboot themselves constantly, changing everything constantly, and so I used to find that kind of annoying. But with Deadpool, because it's like a comedy movie, and Deadpool himself kind of points out all that kind of stuff, so that kind of makes it fine. Like it doesn't take itself too seriously, and that way I can more easily accept those kinds of changes. Even though I think I would have preferred a more serious X-Men movie with a serious story and drama and all that kind of stuff, which cannot work if it's a total comedy movie. So if it's a comedy, then it should be comedy and you cannot take anything seriously. So that might be a little bit of a problem in this movie. Also, Deadpool breaks the fourth wall a little bit too much in my opinion. Sometimes it's funny, so it's worth it. Other times it just takes me out of the movie. So he tells everybody this is just a CGI fight, for example, when certain two characters fight, and that kind of takes you out a little bit. Also, he mentions Patrick Stewart, James McAvoy, stuff like that, that kind of rubs it into you that it's all just a movie. And that's not a good thing in my opinion. I want to be invested into this universe to think it's actually happening, it's a real thing. I don't want to be reminded all the time that it's just a movie. So that's a problem because I much preferred being invested in the story, and so I prefer the more serious X-Men movies actually, with just a little bit of comedy. So that was the perfect combination. So I am a fan of the X-Men movies, even though some of them had all those things that really bugged me. I made a long video, a rant about all the continuity mistakes in this series. I think it's one of the first videos I made on this channel. So just look at one of my older videos. It's an elaborate analysis of all the continuity mistakes in the X-Men franchise, and also me trying to come up with excuses to try to tie it all together. And I really like the movie X-Men Days of Future Past because that movie actually tried to explain away all those continuity mistakes. It actually tried to unite it all together into one cohesive continuity and to fix some of those mistakes. Not all of them, but it actually fixed a lot of the mistakes. It was also a very good movie by itself, probably my favorite X-Men movie. Really well done, and also it introduced time travel as a way to kind of reboot it while still being in the same universe, which was very neat. It kind of that way you can respect all the movies without just saying, oh, that movie, that one is bad, so let's just pretend it never happened. And so that movie actually tried to explain a lot of those inconsistencies and to unite it all together in a perfect way. So that's one of the reasons I really liked it. And in this movie, Deadpool 2, they again introduced time travel, which I guess they can now use to explain away even more inconsistencies. So I guess they can now get away from the old continuity and to change things. And if someone asks, just say, oh, it's because of all the time travel. Because if there are time travelers, then basically it's a multiverse, so a lot of different timelines. So this way we can explain and forgive all the inconsistencies. And I'll be discussing some of them in this video as well. So first of all, a spoiler warning for those who haven't seen it. Even though there are no big surprises or anything, but still I will be discussing the actual things in the movie. So first of all, as a kid, I didn't actually read any comic books, but I did watch all the cartoons, Spider-Man, X-Men, Batman, all the comic book cartoons. I did watch them, and X-Men was one of my favorites, and I fondly remember the episode with Juggernaut and Colossus. So in this movie, they finally did it and did it well. In live action, they showed Juggernaut just like he should look like, just like he looked in the cartoon, and looking perfectly realistic, even though being like a crazy giant monster. And Colossus is probably my favorite character in these Deadpool movies. He's just hilarious and very well done, and much better than the old versions in the old X-Men movies. They had the Colossus who was just pathetic in comparison, and they also had Juggernaut in X-Men 3, which I actually liked. I didn't mind that. I mean, back then it wouldn't have looked realistic to show him as a gigantic CGI monster, and so putting a man in a muscle suit was better probably back then, because they couldn't do it properly as they did now. And I actually liked Juggernaut in X-Men 3. I thought probably it was one of the only good things in that movie. That movie was pretty bad, but all the Juggernaut scenes were really good in my opinion. That part of him chasing Kitty and running through walls and all that stuff, that was probably my favorite scene in that movie. and so I didn't really mind Juggernaut. I know some fans complained about him not being accurate to the comic book, so of course he's not as big, but I was fine with that. In general, I'm fine with movies trying to make things look more realistic. And personally, I don't mind him looking smaller than he should be because, if it's a serious movie, then maybe it should look more realistic. So maybe doing something crazy like having him be such a big giant, that would not look so realistic. And so it was probably a good thing to do that in this movie, which is a comedy. So even if it looks funny, then that's fine because it's a comedy movie. But if they did that in that movie, that would have probably been unintentional comedy. And with all their special effects, it would not have worked. It would have looked like the original Hulk movie, which looked like a cartoon character. So maybe it's a good thing they waited with that. Also, some fans complained because in the comic books he's not actually a mutant, his powers are magical, and yet in that movie they made him a mutant. Again, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with removing all the fantasy elements because I personally prefer the science fiction elements. And also the movie never directly stated he's a mutant. I mean, we can assume the authorities simply mistook him for a mutant and locked him up with the other mutants, while we can still assume he has those magical powers. So if you prefer to think that, you can still do it. And just like with the Phoenix, for example, a lot of people complain about that, we can just assume that Xavier simply mistook it for a split personality. Maybe he didn't realize it was actually a separate entity from space, all that stuff. So I didn't have a huge problem with that. And as for Juggernaut losing his powers next to that kid, it's still not proof because we can just say maybe that kid's power is to cancel all the supernatural powers. So maybe his power is above the magical power of Juggernaut, so it wasn't a big deal in my opinion. And another problem that some fans had was that the movie never established that he's the stepbrother of Charles Xavier, and there was actually a scene of them together and they never actually looked at each other. Like Xavier rolled past Juggernaut and didn't even look at him, and Juggernaut actually removed his helmet during that scene. So if he is wearing that to protect himself from Xavier's telepathy, so how come he didn't have it on when he actually met him in the movie and they never actually looked at each other? So obviously that movie disregarded that little bit, which in Deadpool 2 they didn't. In Deadpool 2 they did address it. And by the way, there was an actual cameo of all the X-Men. They actually showed like the new Professor X, McAvoy, and Quicksilver, and all the new guys. They actually showed them in a brief cameo scene. So I guess that puts Deadpool 2 as taking place in the 80s, I guess, which is a good thing because, Deadpool actually appeared in X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was set before Days of Future Past. That means that movie is still technically canon in terms of continuity because it took place before the change in the timeline. And so what we saw of Deadpool in those flashback scenes actually is still in continuity with this one, even though it really doesn't, because he had some powers there that he doesn't currently have. So it's a bit of a mess, as I said, so continuity is a mess. But we can come up with excuses still to try to fit it all together with excuses, maybe using time travel to explain some of those inconsistencies. But things like their ages shouldn't move even if you use time travel. I mean, the date in which he was born, if it was before all the time alterations, that should still remain fixed. And so if you set Deadpool in today's time, then he would be too old. Like, it doesn't make sense how he was an adult in the 70s. But if you set this movie in the 80s, then that's fine. That fits together well. And the movie keeps itself kind of ambiguous as to what time frame it's actually set in. I don't think we saw anyone using cell phones, for example, so we can assume this movie is taking place somewhere in the 80s or the 90s. And I guess even if they show cell phones, we can assume it's just, the X-Men universe. They have much more advanced technology than we actually have in the real life. In the 70s they had those giant robots at the White House and all that stuff, so obviously it doesn't exist. So even if they do show like current technology, we can still assume it's in the 80s, for example, so that would still be fine. So the movie doesn't actually set itself in any specific date, which is a good thing. That way they don't mess it up even more with the continuity. And as I mentioned, they changed a lot of the characters, so the original Colossus looked like a human, and just when he wanted to power up, then his metal covering appeared, and he was also much smaller. He was a normal size human, and yet here he's a giant. One possible way to explain it is that maybe this Colossus is actually the father of the one we saw in the original X-Men movies, because he looked much younger. He looked like a very young guy, and yet here he looks much older and bigger. So maybe the smaller one is the son of the older one. So maybe that's why he doesn't have the Russian accent anymore in the old movies, and here he does. or maybe he really worked on his English and improved his accent, and maybe he shrunk down for some reason, and his metal covering only appears when he needs it to appear. And it's not the first time that they change up some of these mutant characters. For example, Sabretooth in the original X-Men didn't really look like the one we saw in X-Men Origins Wolverine, who looked more human. So some fans theorize that some mutants undergo some kind of secondary mutation later in life, so they might evolve some kind of new features or new abilities later on. So that can be used to explain that. And also they use that serum that Beast invented to try to explain some of it, to explain how come he can still look like a human even though he looked like a beast earlier and then again later. So maybe he developed a serum, changes his looks, and they also use that to explain how come Xavier could walk for a while. That also fixed some of the continuity contradictions earlier. And so maybe Colossus also used that serum and that made him look more human. And so maybe we can make up another excuse like that for Juggernaut. How come Juggernaut was so big here in Deadpool 2 and yet later on he was so much smaller? And how come he forgot all about his stepbrother, so much so that he never even looked at him when they saw each other and he didn't put on his helmet? So maybe they did some experiments on him, maybe he lost his memory because of that. Maybe they tried to remove his powers and that made him smaller. Maybe they kept him on a low diet when he was in prison and that's why he was smaller. Or we can just use the time travel excuse that someone went back in time and changed something. So maybe someone actually gave steroids to Juggernaut and that did the opposite. It made him bigger than before. And so we can always come up with excuses like that. So it's always fun to try to explain all this mess of a continuity. And as I said, Deadpool is kind of a comedy movie, so it can easily get away with doing stuff like this without it feeling like a spit to the face of the older fans. And strangely, this movie actually honors the comics more than the other movies did. So even though it's a comedy and it is the movie that can do whatever it wants, and ironically, this is actually the movie that is more faithful to the source material. So in short, I like this movie, and especially I loved all the scenes with Juggernaut and Colossus, and it also felt a little bit nostalgic because I remember as a little kid seeing that as a cartoon, and now I see that as a live action movie, which looks so good, so realistic, and so funny, so I really liked it. So that's my thoughts on this movie. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.